Welcome, everyone. We have a fun guest with a fun topic. I can't wait to hear about this. The book is a really fascinating read. It's called Snoop, What Your Stuff Says About You. Snoop by Dr. Sam Gosling. He's a professor of psychology over at the University of Texas at Austin. He's also a visiting fellow at Melbourne University. He's the author of this great book I was just mentioning. He's been featured in the New York Times, Psychology Today, NPR, and a host of other places. And we're going to find out a lot more about what stuff says about you, about space and psychology. So let's find out. Let's not waste any more time. Welcome to the show, Dr. Gosling. Welcome, sir.
Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for being here. This is really a fascinating book. I really love the whole idea about it. And I know it's a little bit older now. It's been a few years, but tell us a little bit about the book, some of the surprises when you wrote it. What did you like? Oh, I can't believe this happened, or this was true. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, it is a little bit older, but it's really about the connections between people and the spaces they occupy, whether living spaces or work spaces. How do we affect our spaces? How do our spaces affect us? And really, what are the sort of psychological links? And although it's been older, of course, with everybody working at home during the coronavirus pandemic, it's in fact, with Zoom rooms, it's become much more relevant, where suddenly people have had to face the question of essentially inviting others into these spaces that our research shows are quite revealing about what people are like. So I think, that's been a really kind of fascinating kind of resurgence of interest in this topic. And so it's been, it's really trying to take a systematic approach to understanding the connections between people and their places.
I remember in the book, one of the things that stood out for me, which we've also seen in crime dramas every so often too, but I think you corroborated it with your research, was the differences in what people had in their pictures, in their home, the picture frames, whether it's family, the children, type of trips. What did you see about that? What did you find out there?
Well, the interesting thing I think about pictures is first, what is the content of those pictures, but also something that we find when we're doing, what we call snooping. The book's called Snooping, so it's the snoopology, the science of snooping, is looking at also the sort of location of them. Just to sort of give you a sort of very brief outline of, of what snooping is about. Snooping is saying, like, what are the objects in a place, like that somebody has photos is interesting. What are the state of these objects? Is it a photo that's obviously picked up a lot and looked at a lot? And then what's the location of them? So all three of those things are important when you're snooping around. Because essentially the state of an object tells you how much it's used. Maybe a photo is not such a good example, but take something like a desk calendar. So, whether somebody has a desk calendar, well, that's a start. But you may have a desk calendar and never use it. So looking at how it's used is critically important, and you see that in terms of the state. And then the location. And here's a great example of the photos. Where do people have their photos? Which photos do they have? So, for example, in people's office spaces, if they have the photos sitting on their desk facing towards the occupant themselves, then it's more about for that person's own psychological state. Maybe they're affecting their thoughts, maybe they're affecting their feelings. Whereas if that very same photo is turned around and facing others who come, it's about identity. It's about saying, hey, this is who I am. This is what I want you to know about me. So, the same photo in a different location says something very different. And I think the other quick point about a photo, which I think is really interesting, is, now we have access to so many photos about us. I think one of the interesting things is to look at the photos that we have of ourselves. And people have remarkably poor self-insight into this. Because, often I will ask somebody, I say, well, why do you have that particular photo, pinned to your refrigerator or something like that? And they'll give me something, that can't be true. It's, oh, I like it. Yeah, I know you like it, but why do you like it? Why this one? Of the 10,000 photos that are available of you, how come this one made it different? Why is it the one of you, meditating on top of a mountain rather than you, staggering down the street drunkenly with your friends yelling at the camera? Well, whereas somebody else would choose the exact opposite photo. So, these photos that people have of themselves, I think, have real insight essentially into the views of ourselves. And that's why I think they're so revealing.
Did you ever get an answer why they had that picture up?
Well, you have to poke a little bit. You have to poke a little bit because, and I think that's true with many things in our home spaces. is that it's, we do just what seems natural to us. And we don't, I mean, some people think about it a lot, but a lot of people don't, because personality is not only about how we behave in the world, it's also how we see the world. So essentially, if you want to, the difference between somebody who's incredibly tidy and organized and somebody who isn't is often about just, at what point does the mess bother them? So they're essentially perceiving it. Somebody would come in and look at what, I've had multiple people come and look at my office. Some people think it's incredibly tidy. Some people think it's terribly messy, and some people think it's about right. And those differences in perceiving the very same office are the sorts of things that drive the behaviors to say, tidy it up or not, or leave it as it is.
Fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. I want your opinion on this take, because I know I heard this the other day, and it was interesting research, and it was about Generation Me, the selfies, and how that's dynamic. I mean, I guess you can say it's the pictures on our desk, as you mentioned earlier, kind of an antiquated version of the selfie in some capacity. What's your take on that, on the regards to the selfies on social media and our relationship to that ether space, I guess?
Yeah, well, I think it's a couple of things. I mean, the first thing is that, showing a lot of pictures about yourself in 2021 has a different meaning than showing a lot of pictures about yourself in 2010. The norms have changed, whereas it might genuinely be, more of a signal of narcissism to have lots of photos of yourselves in 2010. That's not the truth. That's not the same anymore, because the norms have changed about what is appropriate amount of self-expression and so on. But I still think that expressing photos are interesting, and it's a way for us to be able to express our identity, this sense of who we are that we want to broadcast to others. Now, I think one of the kind of conclusions that people jump to when they say, hey, I'm deliberately showing you this photo of me with my friends, or doing that or so on, when they're these deliberate expressions, the immediate thing to be worried about is, well, is this person trying to create a false impression? Is this not how they really see themselves? Are they trying to pull the wool over our eyes? And some of our research, and research being done elsewhere in social psychology, suggests, no, it's probably not. So a lot of work done by Bill Swan, one of my colleagues here at University of Texas, and his colleagues, known as self-verification theory, really suggests and shows that people want to be known. They want to see themselves as others see them. So they're not necessarily interested in providing a positive impression. They want to have a realistic impression. If I see myself as someone with low self-esteem, for example, I don't want you to be, it's disruptive and disturbing and makes me feel I'm not understood, and therefore the world is difficult to understand and so on. If you then see me as a person with positive self-esteem and so on. So a lot of Bill's work has shown that we do a lot of things to bring others to see us as we see ourselves. And we indeed found that. We did a study on Facebook, this was a long time ago, where we showed people photos of, people's Facebook profiles, and that's all they knew about the person. And we asked them, okay, tell us what you think this person's personality is like. And then we compared those impressions based purely on Facebook with two things. On one hand, we based them on what the person was really like, and how we got a measure of that was the person filled out some self-report questionnaires, but also multiple other people told us what that other person was like. So it's not just, if the person was deluded about themselves, this wouldn't work. So it's a combination of what I think about myself and my friends think about myself. That was one of the things we compared these observers' impressions with. And then the other thing we compared it about with was my ideal self. What would I ideally like to be like? Because then we could say, okay, is it the case that the impression you get from somebody's Facebook is more closely tied to that person's ideal self or their real self? And what we found overwhelmingly was it's much closer to people's real self. They weren't just projecting an ideal self. I mean, it's possible they were trying to project an ideal self and failing, but they certainly weren't accurately projecting an ideal self. And of course, there's lots of reasons, once you begin to think about it, of why that would be. So, you can make sense of that finding, once you know it.
Oh, fascinating indeed. It kind of reminded me initially about the persona with Jung, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
But it sounds like it was more of an actual self, as you mentioned, than the ideal self. Fascinating indeed. Now, did you ever do any research where you did the same similar comparisons with an MMPI or some kind of other assessment like that, or was that just too much time consumption on that?
The personalities that we used was the Big Five personality scale. So as you know, this is the most widely used and generally well accepted measure of ordinary everyday personality. So it's sort of like the as you know, the MBTI, but kind of more developed more sort of systematically and used more widely in scientific and applied circles now. And so, yeah, we were using essentially the Big Five network, for the Big Five framework for our research.
Perfect. And let me ask you this. I know in your book you also mentioned, if I remember correctly, there were sharp edges on the picture frames. There were rounded edges in the picture frames. Did you ever look at colors?
We didn't look at colors ourselves. No, we didn't. So, I do believe all of those things are important. The difficulty, of course, is that each, how do you analyze a space? Like, do you analyze the broad features of it? Like, is it decorated? Is it inviting? Is it friendly? Is it stylish? Those sorts of things versus the individual items. Do you look at the specific objects in that item, like the sharp edges and so on? And what we found was the most telling clues tended to be these higher level ones. So, for example, this dimension, this sort of feature of a space which we call distinctive. And it is, and again, this isn't a special technical definition. It's like if people go into your place, ordinary everybody goes in and think, oh, this place looks distinctive. It looks different from others. We can all kind of use that kind of gestalt impression of pulling together all the items to say, is it distinctive? That was a very strong clue, for example, for the personality trait of openness. Whereas if you look at if you just get into the really small details, the truth is there's many reasons why you might have that particular detail. So you might have a sharp edge picture because that's something you really like, or just because somebody gave it to you, or because that's all you could afford, or that's all they had in the store then. So once you begin to get down to these very fine-grained details, then the possible causes of those details begin to multiply in a huge way, and it becomes very difficult to build up these sort of generalizable systematic patterns that we're looking for in our research.
Fascinating stuff. There's a book, I can't remember now. I'm sure you read it as well, but it might have been years too. It's been a long time. It was an older book. I think it was named by Hall. And he talked about proxemics. Remember that years ago? Certain distance between people. Did you notice anything in regards to, I think the book mentions that distance between furniture and how much space there is in a house compared to, some homes cluttered. You just, you're kind of like a labyrinth trying to get around that place. Others much broader. Did you find anything on that?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of things which you can look at with respect to the furniture. So one of the things is, yes, this idea of, is it sort of cluttered, disorganized chaos, as something that's very cramped and so on, and that is associated with a personality trait known as conscientiousness. So how organized and reliable and so on is that there are. But you can also look at the furniture in another way, and that would be essentially in how inviting it is. So if you think about the trait of extroversion, what is it that really defines extroverts? Extroverts like and enjoy being with people. They want to be around people. They have, they prefer music which has voices in it. They essentially, for being with people, a party for an extrovert it generates their batteries. They like it, they enjoy it, they come out feeling energized and exhilarated. Whereas an introvert comes out of a party feeling exhausted. They may be able to kind of fake it and go through it, but actually they need a rest afterwards and so on. So there's this very, essentially it's this difficult orientation to social stimulation. And so you see that reflected in the furniture in people's places. So the home of an extrovert is laid out for people to enjoy and entertain. It's something that will lure people in and make them linger there. And that's true, even in office spaces too. Whereas the home space or an office space of an introvert, it's not so inviting, it's not so welcoming. It's set up at home for the person to maybe sit in a comfortable chair and read alone, or just them and one other person. So these kind of basic orientations towards, in this case, social stimulation are reflected in the furniture. And I think one additional point about this these kinds of spaces is that people will often use, when they're reasoning about themselves, they'll use the same logic to come up with completely different explanations for their space. So I'll give you a concrete example. I would often look around and assess people's spaces in New York, and people would often say to me, "Well, I'm in New York. I have a tiny space. Of course, it's a mess. It's so small. How could I possibly keep something like this tidy?" But then you go into the apartment next door, and they say, "Hey, I live in a tiny space in New York. Of course, I have to keep it completely tidy and organized because it's so small." So essentially, they're using the exact same explanation, the fact that they're in New York, they have to be in a small space, to explain the complete opposite behavior. So what does that tell you? That tells you that their explanation isn't actually the right one. It's more actually to do with their personality, how they see the space, how they live in the space, and so on. So I think it's one of the interesting domains where everybody has thoughts about space, everybody experiences it and forms impressions about it. But I think our insights about the forces driving the different arrangements of space are often off the mark.
It's amazing, really a fascinating topic. I do consulting with law enforcement and sometimes in the military concerning. You ever heard of the Combat Hunter program?
No.
They have a component of it where they look at their operating environment and they'll look to see, for instance, one of the examples that they tend to use a lot is in Iraq. So if they're driving down every day and everybody's either booing or cheering them, this is years ago when they were driving through an Iraq town and people were booing or cheering, and then the next day they drove by and they didn't see anybody in the town, they would be like, okay, something's up. There's nobody out here. Everybody's hiding.
Yeah.
Something is going to happen here. It's not good. But when you look at the Combat Hunter program, they have things like iconography. So they're looking at graffiti and what it says. They're looking at tagging and what it says. Did you ever go on the outside element as well in regards to space and what that says about human personality and the collective?
Yeah, so we looked at sort of public spaces too, and in fact, much of our research that we're doing now involves broader spaces. So we went, beyond living spaces and offices to looking at public places like cafes and bars, and now, quite a lot of our recent work is in neighborhoods and in cities and so on. And rather looking at sort of the features of those spaces, we essentially look at the overall personalities of those places. And by this, I mean, we have stereotypes. For example, there is a stereotype about is kind of the anxious, uptight, maybe more aggressive East Coasters, the busy, neurotic New Yorker versus the laid-back Californian who's, taking things easy, the dude from the Big Lebowski type of character. And so we have these, geographic stereotypes. Is there anything to them? And so we've been collecting data for decades now on the internet, personality data, and we know people's zip codes because they volunteer to give that to us. And so that allows us to say, well, are there these geographic differences in personality? And the short answer is yes, there are. And do they align with stereotypes? Well, in many cases they do. It is true that California is lower on neuroticism than New York. So some of the stereotypes are true. And then importantly, do these things relate to outcomes? And we find that they do. We find that, for example, the neuroticism of a state or a county predicts strongly some of the health-related outcomes, things like heart disease and cancer and so on. And other traits predict other things. The openness to experience of a state predicts number of patents taken out in that state or the number of museum visits and those sorts of things. The agreeableness of a state predicts crime levels in that state. So, once you kind of aggregate these things up to a bigger level, that allows you to begin to, do these analyses of all these other outcomes that are really quite important, but that are collected at, say, the state level or the county level or the city level.
Fascinating stuff. That's really fascinating. Wow. I don't know. Are you familiar at all with CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design?
No,
Okay.
I'm not.
I was going to see if there was any overlap there. Basically, the concept is that you design the environment to deter crime, prevent crime. So they might put bollards in the front of like a Target has those big red balls, and that's designed for cars not to go up and crush the customers. They have other things too, but pathways, whatever. Okay, let me get off of that then and switch over to our last few minutes. I don't want to take up all your time. I really appreciate it. Again, folks, the book is called Snoop. You can find it on Amazon. The author is Sam Gosling, Gosling, just in case you're listening to us on the podcast. Dr. Gosling, so we've covered a lot of territory. We talked about furniture a little bit. We've talked about picture frames, a little bit about colors. What other areas did you look at in regards to space? I mean, did you look at sounds? Did you look at whether they had those waterfalls in the background? What was going on?
Well, one of the things is we didn't look at those sorts of sounds. I mean, we did, one of the broad environmental ratings we used were things like, is it quiet or is it noisy and so on. But we have done quite a lot of work looking at music and music preferences. So, if you ask people to get to know each other, especially if you ask sort of college age people, they will often talk about music as essentially a shorthand way of getting to know people. And what we found is that if you could just show somebody's favorite record, so I could ask you, what is your all-time top 10 records? And I show those to somebody else, and they don't see anything other than that top 10. They can do pretty well at guessing what your personality is like. And so, and I think, this, in a way, it's another one of the ways that we express ourselves. We express ourselves by talking about the certain types of music, because different music is associated with things that are related to what we're like. They may be related to values, the sorts of values we have. The sorts of music, the sorts of values you may hear expressed in country music may vary to the sorts of values you hear expressed in punk rock. They also relate to things like essentially stimulation level. Some music is much more calming, some is much more, exhilarating or loud or, stimulating and so on. And so these sorts of dimensions, again, all reflect the very basic elements of our personality that, again, provide more clues to the kinds of people we are.
It's fascinating because I always wanted to, I need to get more students to start focusing on nostalgia. I think that's always had such an impact. I'm assuming you might probably saw that in the house, which is very, very telling of people if they had certain nostalgic items around the house, maybe 30, 40-year-old items. Yeah, fascinating.
Well, that's true for music, right? We know from other people's research, not mine, that people, there's a certain sort of period, essentially the late teens and early 20s, where people kind of fixate on that period as the moment to be nostalgic about, and they will continue to enjoy music that they were listening to when that was around when they were that age and so on. So it's a really
it's fascinating because I tweeted the other day, I think it was 12 Angry Men, and then I tweeted something with Fats Domino. And the amazing amount of people that tweeted back saying, I needed this. It's been a rough year. It's great to go back in time into that glory moment, I guess. It was really fascinating to see that psychologically.
But different people would have a different glory moments, of course, so, for different people, right. I mean, for others, you could, you would tweet about Clueless and Britney Spears, and they would find, thank you so much for taking me back to that moment. So, the whole point is different people have different, moments of, glory and to be nostalgic about.
Now, in our last few minutes here, I have two more questions, I guess, or three. One of them is combined. One of them is about, I hear an accent. So is it British or Australian?
Yeah, I'm from the UK, yeah.
All right. So you have a whole different experience as well. And your space is going to be different comparatively to here. I'm looking at, I'm thinking in the back of my mind, like shows like as time goes by and trying to remember the apartment structure that they had on that show. Faulty Towers was kind of unique. So I'm not sure if that works. But anyway. How did culture play a role in regards to space and psychology? Did it play a role?
Culture plays a huge role, yes, and so that's so essentially you can think about sort of personality being these sorts of basic expressions for things like openness is the idea that I like new things, new ideas, abstract ideas, and so on. And so this would sort of be a very sort of basic personality trait. But then, of course, how that actually gets expressed will be very different in Japan than it is in the US, than it is in the UK, than it is in Nigeria. So the very same trait will, of course, be expressed differently. And even within a culture. So, when we were doing our studies, when we were looking, for example, at student dorm rooms, we had student judges go in and look at these spaces because they are able to interpret it. They can see, they know the cultural meaning of various objects and so on that I wouldn't be able to detect. So culture is hugely important. And then related to the other place of saying, I'm a UK person living in the US. Another point is, of course, your context makes a big difference to your identity. So when I'm in the UK, I don't feel like I'm particularly British because everybody's British. It's just, there's no point distinguishing myself. But then when you come to the US, that's what essentially distinguishes yourself. So you may be more inclined to express things like your national identity because you feel it more when it is distinguishing you from others. And of course, also, you may want to have these sorts of reminders of that to make you feel more comfortable, remind you of those times and symbols that you're more used to.
Fascinating stuff, because now it makes me think of this. There's probably going to be a lot of generational differences in the space of psychology. It's going to be rural compared to urban. We're going to have differences.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, fascinating stuff.
And even neighborhood to neighborhood, where those are quite different too.
Yeah, absolutely. Does religion play a role? I'm assuming it does too.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, so religion can play a role in terms of the sorts of the cultural icons that we would want to display, especially if religion is an important part of our identity, especially if religion serves as a means for influencing our own thoughts and our own feelings, because lots of the things we put up in spaces are about making ourselves feel a certain way. I put up something because I enjoy looking at it and it reminds me of a special time. Or I could do it to express my identity. I could put up a religious or cultural icon in order to tell others this is who I am and therefore find the world more enjoyable and predictable because I feel who I am.
Fascinating stuff. Again, like I always say, I could be here all day with you, Dr. Gosling. Get no work done, but this is fascinating stuff. My last question is, do you catch yourself watching shows like Friends or Frasier? I know these are more outdated shows, but maybe more modern day shows and looking at their apartments or their houses and saying, oh, I wonder if this looks like a more conscientious person or more open or less.
I do look at people's apartments and spaces, but I don't think actually that's just unique to me. I think we all do it, and we don't notice we're doing it because it comes so naturally to us. I mean, for most of our evolution, other humans have been the biggest sources of opportunities and the biggest sources of threats. So that's why we're so finely attuned to trying to look for information about other people. And what we have learned just through experience is people's spaces are often very diagnostic about that person, which is why, when we're in a Zoom meeting with lots of other people, it's so fascinating to look and see what they're like because we tend to be getting a new insight into them, something we didn't get when we knew them only in the work context, for example.
Yeah, I kind of ruined that for everybody because I use the green screen, so it throws everybody off. But we have to bring it back if you're ever willing to do it, Dr. Gosling. I'd love to do something with you if you're game for it. Would be to put some pictures up of some of these TV shows, and maybe you can give us some insight what you see.
I could give it a try. I don't know if I'd be any better than anybody else, but I could give it a try.
Thank you so much again, Dr. Gosling. The book is called Snoop. Check it out. It's on Amazon.com. Thank you very much, Dr. Gosling, for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Make sure if you want to support our podcast to share and subscribe. And check out our playlist if you're on YouTube. We got some fun stuff you want to catch. Thanks, everyone.